Hello and welcome to this afternoon's international webinar organised by Disabled People Against Cuts, DPAC, and the European Network on Independent Living, ENIL. The subject we're going to be discussing this afternoon is, can inquiries under the optional protocol to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities improve states' accountability and facilitate access to independent living? My name is Ellen Clifford and I am here representing Disabled People Against Cuts, DPAC, today, and I'm going to be one of the moderators for this afternoon. On the information that was sent out, some of you will have seen it was our Mandy Colleran from DPAC who was due to moderate. Sadly, Mandy is ill, so you're going to hear too much from me today as I'll be speaking and moderating, along with Jamie Bolling from ENIL. Disabled People Against Cuts was set up in 2010 to oppose the brutal cuts that happened as a result of austerity and welfare reform measures introduced by the government since 2010. What we found is that the government then and subsequent governments from 2010 onwards were not listening to what disabled people were saying was happening to us. Some of the public were aware of what was happening, but many others weren't at that time. We tried using the law courts, but we found that there were very few points of law that we could use, and that if the government could show in many cases that they knew the measures they were introducing would discriminate against disabled people, then that made it okay. They just had to prove that they'd looked into it and were aware of the discriminatory impacts of what they were doing. The courts were also very nervous to make rulings on economic matters. We had allies in Parliament, but they simply didn't have the numbers to overturn what the government was doing. And thus we turned to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, UNCRPD, and we triggered a special investigation under the optional protocol. So that's where we come in, because that investigation happened and it made serious findings against our government. They were found guilty of grave and systematic violations of disabled people's rights. So this afternoon, we're going to be looking at the inquiry that happened in the UK and also a more recent inquiry that happened in Hungary. How this afternoon is going to work is that our meeting and our discussion here is being streamed live on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter, and the meeting will be recorded and available to watch again for anyone who misses it live. In a few moments, Jamie Bolling from ENIL, after introducing herself, she will be putting some questions to representatives from the UK about our experiences of the inquiry that happened and that we triggered. That will take around 20 minutes. Following that, I will then be putting questions to the Hungarian campaigners who were involved in their own special investigation about their experiences. From about 4:30 British summertime, or oh no, sorry. I'm getting my timings muddled up. So from 4:30 Central European summertime onwards, Jamie will be taking questions from you, the listeners, to put to all of the speakers from both the UK and Hungary. And how we want those questions to come in is for those of you who are watching on whatever platform, whether Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube. If you put your questions in the comments section, then we have someone who is checking those and who will relay those to us here to put to the speakers. We should be finishing around 4 p.m. British summertime, 5 p.m. Central European summertime. And the hashtag we are using is hashtag CRPD inquiries. So do please encourage other people to watch and to share. So I will now hand over to Jamie to talk a little bit more about who she is, who ENIL are, and how this afternoon is going to work.
Hello, and thank you very much, Ellen, and thank you to all of you that are following this important webinar today. I think you described very clearly what we're going to be doing. I'll just give a little information for those who don't know ENIL. I myself am a co-chair, along with Nadja Haddad, and a former director of ENIL, the European Network on Independent Living. So we promote independent living, a EU organization with over 40 members. And in this, one of the main things we try to promote is the closure of institutions and also the rights of disabled people which we'll be talking about more today. From there, I think we'll go on directly to the next session because we want to take a little bit of time for the different speakers in the sessions to present themselves. And in this one, it's yourself, Ellen, and then there is Debbie Abraham, MP in the UK, Rian Davies from Disability Wales, and Heather Fisken. So if each of you would like to take just 1 minute, maybe in that order. So would you start, Eleanor?
Yeah.
And after
Sorry.
Ellen, it would be you, Debbie. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I'm Ellen, as I said, and I'm from Disabled People Against Cuts, and I was involved in reporting to the UN Disability Committee over a number of years. I think that's all I need to say on me.
And I'm Debbie Abrahams. I'm the Member of Parliament for Oldham East and Saddleworth. And at the time of the UK inquiry by the UN Committee, I was Shadow Minister for Disabled People. And thanks again for inviting me and for doing this, such an important piece of work.
Thank you. And then Rian Davies.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rian Davies. I'm Chief Executive of Disability Wales, which is the National Association of Disabled People's Organisations in Wales, striving for the rights and equality of all disabled people. I gave evidence to the subcommittee of the UN committee when it came to the UK for its inquiry under the optional protocol. I attended a meeting in Cardiff in Wales, our capital city, and sort of outlined the dire situation that austerity had imposed on disabled people in Wales.
Thank you very much. And then Heather.
Hello, welcome to Scotland and from afar. I'm Heather Fisken. I'm Head of Policy and Research at Inclusion Scotland, and very similar to Disability Wales, we are a disabled people's organisation and we have a membership of DPOs right across Scotland, and Inclusion Scotland leads on the civil society reporting work on the CRPD for Scotland. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. The first question in this session is, what did DPAC do to trigger the UK investigation, and how did the UK government respond to the report? Ellen, please.
Thanks, Jamie. So the idea to try and trigger this investigation was the idea of one of DPAC's co-founders, a disabled campaigner called Debbie Jolly, who is very sadly no longer with us. It was Debbie's idea to try and do this because it had never been done before, and the research team, she worked with the research team at DPAC to send extensive information over a number of years to the Disability Committee. There were just so much evidence of what was happening, and I think that was partly because I think people just didn't know what to do. They'd never been faced within our lifetimes as disabled campaigners anyway, faced with a government who knew what they were doing but really didn't care. And I think the way many people reacted to that was to just try and evidence. They were sort of in shock, and they kind of, I think some people thought that, you know, that the more evidence, the more overwhelming the evidence was that the government would have to respond to some of the concerns. So there was and there still are today, just an overwhelming number of reports, very robust research that goes on showing what the impacts of government policy on disabled people are, and that meant there was a lot of stuff to send to the UN Disability Committee, and I have felt sorry for them, the amount that we've sent them over the years. And eventually I think the evidence before them was such that they had no choice but to undertake this investigation, and it hadn't been done before, and everyone I think had to work out as they went along how to do it. We had public lawyers helping DPAC, and we managed to make that happen, and I think that was one of the greatest legacies of Debbie's, who, as I say, is sadly no longer with us. And how did the government respond? They completely dismissed the findings. I think one government minister at the time, Damien Green, described the report as outdated and patronising. They completely dismissed it. They said they didn't recognise it at all. And they tried to discredit the committee itself and their expertise. And of course, they'd looked through thousands of pages of documents. They'd come over to the UK, spent 2 weeks touring around, visiting people, speaking to hundreds of witnesses. They knew what was happening over here and the minutiae of welfare reform policy, I think, at that stage, a lot better than most politicians. Yeah, so I mean, it was very upsetting, I think, for a lot of people that the government just rejected it out of hand, but that was their approach.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm on. Thank you very much. Yeah, that's very discouraging when they just dismiss it. What do we do then? Anyway, next question. What was DPAC's strategy for using the UK investigation to achieve improvements in the lives of disabled people? How well did it work? And then was there anything you would have done differently in hindsight? Both yourself and Debbie Abraham will answer this question, Ellen.
So if I start and talk about DPAC's strategy, and then I think it'd be good to hear from Debbie what she thinks it might have changed, if anything, and how it worked. I think there were, as I say, many people who were upset that the government rejected the findings out of hand. I have to say that I was not surprised by that, because that had been their approach all along when issues were raised with their policies. I think the strategy that we were prepared to adopt was one of just shaming the government and of using that finding to try and build public awareness for what was actually happening, and really change the narrative. The narrative at that time was that the government was trying to fix a broken system, and that meanwhile they were protecting the most vulnerable. Sadly, the report was published. We had no warning when the report actually came out. The government had been given 6 months to respond, is my understanding, to the committee's report and their findings, but we didn't have sight of it over that time. And the first that we knew that it was coming out was when the Mail on Sunday did a report basically discrediting it, and also picking on individual members of the committee and trying to discredit them, which was really quite a despicable thing to do. And the timing of the report coincided with the US elections when Trump was elected. So all the journalists that we'd had lined up to cover it whenever it did come out weren't available. So our strategy for publicly shaming the government failed because of that. I mean, we did get some coverage, but then I think we worked hard over the years to build greater awareness that finding had come out. And I think, you know, over the subsequent years, we did manage, all of us together, disabled campaigners and our allies in Parliament and in the media, and from allied campaign groups, did succeed in changing that narrative, so that I would say that now we have, I think we probably do have, I'd say, the public on our side in terms of knowing what government policies have done and how they've affected disabled people. What we achieved, I'd say, is that we have achieved an unprecedented profile for the UNCRPD within the UK opposition parties have all now pledged to enshrine it in domestic legislation if elected. We've had debates in Parliament on it, and I think disabled people are now very highly aware of the fact that the convention exists, and whether they are getting their rights met or not, they're aware that those rights are written down. And I think that gives disabled people the confidence to move forwards in trying to progress their rights even further. Every year, because our government have been so shockingly bad at disrespecting the convention, they have to report back to the committee every year at the moment on how they've done in following up with in implementing the recommendations, both from the special investigation and the subsequent routine investigation that happened in 2017. And we report back as well every year, because what that does is it gives campaigners across the UK a chance to discuss what our shared key priorities are. And I think that really helps to focus us on our campaigning and our lobbying and coordinating to be stronger together. And there have been things that have been achieved over the years in spite of the government, because we've all been coordinated in pushing for the same thing. So, for example, law courts have overturned changes that the government tried to bring into personal independence payment benefit in limiting eligibility on that. So I think that it's actually it's been a very good tool for focusing us as a movement together and what we want to achieve. I'll hand over to Debbie for what she wants to say.
Thanks, Ellen. And I was also involved in as one of the interviewees of the committee when they came to the UK in 2015. I think I've been in post as Shadow Minister for Disabled People for about a week. And it's also how I became involved with Ellen and with DPAC. And, you know, I can't praise them more highly. They have done a fantastic job. I think over the sort of previous 5-6 years, there had been a move steadily against the importance of social security and social security claimants, but particularly focused on disabled people, where there was a demonizing of disabled people. In the language, the rhetoric that was used was particularly nasty. And so the attitudes of the general public, I think, to disabled people, and particularly those who are reliant on social security, social protection, as defined within the convention, was appalling. It really was, and that was then justified as the reason for why some of the ideological cuts to support across all policy areas, but particularly social security, as I say, how it was justified. And without the work that DPAC did to provide the evidence to the UN, and hopefully I supported that in my own small way, I don't think we would have seen the shift in attitudes. And that's reported within the British Social Attitudes Survey in terms of the recognition of the particular harm to disabled people. So there's been very much a change if you look at the Social Attitudes Survey and the recognition of the impact on disabled people. That is now appreciated. However, I still think we have a lot more to do, and this is Ellen mentioned in terms of the timing of the release of the report and how that was affected. So mainstream media, I still think there's a lot more to do, and so that the public as a whole, as I say, there have been shifts, but we need to do much more to spread the message. We think that 1 in 5, 14 million people across the UK have a disability. That hasn't been reflected in the engagement, but also in terms of the push for change. And it's only when we have that large groundswell support that we will get the policy changes that we need. So there have been incremental sort of tinkering at the edges changes, but nothing meaningful. And as Ellen has said, the draconian cuts, 36 billion to working age people, a large percentage of that has been to disabled people in cuts and support. And as I say, it goes right across the whole policy spectrum. So I think there's a lot more that we need to do around communicating our message, around engaging across all disabled people, and to shift those attitudes even more. And that's the way that we really will see the changes. Just one point, if I may add, we have our own statutory body, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and they must also be held to account in terms of the investigations and the inquiries that they set up or they don't. And I think, again, that's something that we should, in the UN, may want to look at in terms of a body that's meant to be independent and meant to be monitoring how this is, how we fare. It probably isn't ideal. Thanks very much.
Thank you both. At the end of that, was there anything you would have done differently in hindsight? Eleanor, Debbie.
Yes, I was worried about using up too much of my time. Yes, so I think the two key things really that come to mind, firstly, is that I think we should have prepared people a lot better for the possibility, and as I say, I thought it was a strong possibility that the government would just reject the findings, because there was nothing forcing them to even accept the recommendations, let alone implement them. And I think that really, really hurt a lot of people and really upset them, because when people are feeling that desperate about their day-to-day lives, people want something to cling on to that gives them hope. And I think we'd really underestimated how many people had placed that hope in the investigation. And we had to do a lot of work after the findings came out and the government's response to kind of pick people up and try and encourage them to keep campaigning. And I think we should have prepared a lot better for that. The other thing is, I do think that I would perhaps in hindsight would have been stronger at helping the committee to understand what our government at that time was like. I know they were quite shocked and appalled by the leak to the Mail on Sunday and the way it went after individual members. And I think that all this time we'd spent keeping it a secret so the government weren't upset, meant that we lost the chance to get some publicity on it. And I suppose I see that our biggest chance for effecting change was through sort of pushing from the outside on the issue rather than working with them, just because of their nature. And I think that they were given maybe a bit too much kind of trust and credibility within their engagement in the process, when they were really just very rude and very dismissive to the committee. And I think maybe we should have prepared them a bit better for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's very fair in terms of what Ellen's saying. There's also, I think, been an assumption in terms of the correctness. You present evidence in a rational way, which is showing the harm. There is the assumption that will then be stopped. And as Ellen said, I think that was optimistic. And it's also about the politics and the politics of decision making, which I think we probably should have done more to understand. And that's why I said in my my other bit about the importance of understanding how political decision making is undertaken, and the importance in relation to that of the communication. So if there is a wider concern beyond the disabled community, that's when the government starts to take note. It shouldn't be, but this is the reality of how, unfortunately, political decision making is made. so an understanding about the influences on the different points as well, the timings around how to influence political decision making, all very, very important. But I think everybody, including myself, we learnt a lot from this, and I know we're all working very, very hard to do what we can to, as I say, influence as much as we can, following on from the excellent work that was done by the UN committee, and I'm very, very grateful to them. I reiterate what Ellen has said, that the attacks that were on individual members were just unacceptable. This is a nasty, nasty world of politics, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you both. DPAC has been an example for a long time, and I think this work is very interesting. I am unmuted as well. Yeah, okay. And it's teaching me a lot. So thank you very much for the work and your comments here. We'll go on to the last question that I have in this session is, what positive changes did the investigation help to influence in the devolved nations? And there we start with you, Rian, from Disability Wales.
Thank you, Jamie. Apologies if there's a lot of background noise. We've got Storm Francis raging in Wales at the moment, so very high-speed winds. So the trees are lashing against the window. So apologies for that. So it's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon. As I mentioned, I'm from Disability Wales. And just to give a bit of context about the situation in Wales, Wales has the highest number, or the highest proportion of disabled people within the nation of Wales compared to anywhere else in the UK. And also Wales has the highest proportion of disabled people living in poverty. Nearly 40% of disabled people in Wales live in poverty. So the impact of the UK government's austerity programme on disabled people in Wales, the cuts in the benefit system and cuts to services such as social care and independent living, had a massive impact on disabled people in Wales. Also to mention that the Welsh government, so it's a devolved government, and that's run by the Welsh Labour Party. They are the party that were elected to run the Welsh government. So it's a different political party in Wales compared to the UK government, which is the Conservative Party, although at the time of the review under the optional protocol, it was the coalition government between Conservatives and Liberal Democrats. So there's a very different political makeup in Wales. So that will probably have a bearing on some of the comments that I'll be making. So to mention, just to mention again, Disability Wales was involved in the inquiry that was taken under the optional protocol. We gave evidence to committee members who did a tour of the UK, and we met them in Cardiff, and we explained, sort of chapter and verse, the impact that austerity had on disabled people in Wales. And then I think there was, in a way, the review under the optional protocol was sort of like the start of almost a chapter of different events, which I think helped us to build momentum in Wales. Because after the year after the publication of the damning report by the UN committee under the optional protocol, then there was the standard review of UK government's implementation of the UNCRDP, which the Welsh government also participated in. During that process, Disability Wales ran a lot of engagement in Wales with disabled people, raising awareness both of the outcome of the special inquiry, but then also the opportunity to give further evidence to the to the standard inquiry, and then that reported. We gave a lot of publicity to it in Wales and to the findings, and then the year later there was the visit of the UN rapporteur, special rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights, which we were also involved in giving evidence, and yet another damning report from a senior UN official into the impact of poverty and breach of human rights in the UK, including in Wales. So I think between those three inquiries and investigations, we were able to build up quite a mass of evidence. We were able to engage a lot of disabled people in the work, becoming aware of what the UNCRDP was all about. And I think that also the findings of the successive reports did have quite an impact on Welsh Government, because while all of this was going on, we were working with Disability Wales was working with Welsh Government into the review of the framework for action on independent living, which is the Welsh Government's cross-cutting strategic approach to tackling the barriers that disabled people face to independent living. It had originally been published in 2013, so a review was going on during the 2016, 2017, 2018 period. And when the report was published, the new Action on Disability Framework was published last autumn. Welsh Government openly acknowledged in the Action on Disability Framework the work of the UN in raising and highlighting the barriers that disabled people face in achieving independent living, but also the breaches that had been identified, which had been particularly aimed at the UK government. In the new Action on Disability Framework, Welsh Government recommits itself to delivering policies within the context of the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People, and also to the social model of disability. And also it has commissioned research from Swansea University in Wales into how it could strengthen and advance human rights in Wales, particularly in the context that the UK is going to be leaving the European Union at the end of this year, what's known as Brexit. So as Disability Wales, we and our members are very much lobbying for the Welsh Government to incorporate the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People into Welsh law, and which we hope will be part of a Welsh Human Rights Act. So I think for us, the initial inquiry and the subsequent UK review, and then the report, the investigation of the UN rapporteur, has really built momentum around the UNCRDP in Wales, and I think it's enabled us to push at an open door. And as part of our manifesto for the Senedd parliamentary elections in Wales next year, calling for the incorporation of the UNCRDP in Welsh law will be our #1 goal. Thank you very much.
And thank you. So I'm trying to push these buttons. Okay, there you are, Heather, please.
Hello again, it's Heather from Inclusion Scotland. And just to say, first of all, that there are obvious similarities with the Welsh situation. In Scotland, we have a devolved government. Very briefly, we've been going for about 20 years with a devolved government, and many of the things that we are most concerned with as disabled people are devolved entirely to Scotland, such as education, employment, social care. Also notably, human rights is devolved to Scotland, and we have our own Scottish Human Rights Commission, but we are also supported by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, the UK body that Debbie referred to. So, yeah, as Rand was saying, in Wales, the CRPD does help to bring rights of disabled people to the fore. But as she also said, they're not incorporated into our national law. That's something we're working on at the moment. We know that when the periodic review was coming up and was planned, the Scottish Government took active steps to set up a strategic national plan called Fair Scotland for Disabled People. As with many of these things, very good in places, but a lot of it was very dated. It was old stuff. It wasn't actually going to make the changes that were needed to make the difference to disabled people's lives. There have been more changes more recently. That report was 2016. More recently, many of the disability benefits have been devolved to Scotland, and we now have our own Social Security agency and a Social Security Commission and Commissioner for these devolved benefits. And interestingly, one of the first things they did was to write a charter for Social Security in Scotland. And on the face of that charter, it says Social Security is a human right, plain and simple, recognising that the role of the Commission is to scrutinise all the legislation and regulation that comes out around these benefits, and to do so with a human rights prism on it. So that's one example. Another example, employment. Obviously, employment is reserved to the UK government, but employability, the services that support people to get into employment, is a devolved issue. And we have a plan in Scotland to at least half the gap. Why at least half the gap and not just get rid of the employment gap, the difference between the number of disabled people employed and the number of non-disabled people who are in employment at working age? So it's a plan. There's a lot of stuff in it. How much of that is actually going to be instrumental in having the gap or getting anywhere near getting rid of the gap is a different thing. And it does reference, like many of the plans and policies coming out of Scottish Government, it does reference human rights and the CRPD. But we need to keep questioning whether this is just an example of lip service and whether there is actually anything meaningful in it, and to keep holding government to account, which is what our role is as the third sector, as charities and civil society. Independent living, and this is where I bring in the subject of the coronavirus. We've seen recently that social care packages have been slashed. They've been removed almost overnight, leaving people in really, really dire states. And we need to see and explore moving forward why that happened and where were the human rights of these disabled people. But to add on to that, and this is going back to some of the things that Ellen was talking about, there's some softer wins about the optional protocol and the process. You do raise awareness in the press, and you get more awareness throughout society of that the really toxic issue with welfare reform, of the everyday issues facing disabled people. Obviously, you cannot time an American election, and you have to accept that these things can't always be in our control. Also, the CRPD, even the annual report that we do, it gives us leverage when we're doing briefings to Parliament, when we're giving evidence to Parliament, when we're submitting a consultation report. We can refer to the evidence we have provided to the UN, so it does give a lot of leverage. It's a door knocker for when you want to talk to ministers. They will listen to the fact that we have put evidence to the committee in the United Nations. You can ask, can we have a meeting about this? It does work. Also, I think I have to add the fact that the foreign nations, UN, DPAC, other organisations in England and in Northern Ireland, it's helped us to work together more closely and to understand the differences in devolution, to cherry pick from each other. For example, I know that whenever I do speak in the Westminster, I always make the point when they're talking about welfare reform, look at Scotland, there is another way of doing this. You can have human rights in social security. You can have working groups which will look at how people communicate with and from and to the Social Security Agency. The other thing, going back to where I started, which was incorporation work, obviously there's a number of covenants, there's a number of conventions, and you cannot always expect parliamentarians and decision makers at strategic level to always constantly have CRPD at the top of the tree. We have to recognise the other conventions as well and work together with them. So we are working on modelling and incorporation of CRPD into Scots law. and hopefully that will take us somewhere. But I think the big message here is that in Scotland, it's not just one thing, it's a whole group of things coming together, and you try and pull and push with all the other things that are happening in the environment at the same time. At least that's how we've optimized it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you, for this session and your points and the work that DPAC has done. I knew Debbie Jolly personally, so it's fantastic to hear how far this has come, the work that's been done after Debbie unfortunately left us too early. The raising of awareness, the getting rights into legislations, then the dismissal, which is so scary to hear, but we all believe in the systems. There's many others who do as well. So somehow it's getting the average citizen's voices heard. But we'll go from there to you then, Ellen, to talk about the next inquiry. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jamie. So we're now going to begin the next half of the session, which will be looking at the inquiry and the recommendations from Hungary. So to begin with, I'm going to ask the speakers to introduce themselves. And so if you could just spend just a minute just saying who you are, who you're representing and what your role in the inquiry was, that would be great. So looking at the agenda, I'll follow the order for who's answering which question first. And if we go to Katarine first, please, to introduce yourself.
Hello, good afternoon, and thank you to all of you, to all of the organizers, to ENIL, for this invitation today to listen to you and to discuss with you about the inquiry procedures, the experience on inquiry procedures, and also the future actions. But if I may start, just I would like to recognize, to take the opportunity of the time, to take these 30 seconds to really remember and to honor the memory of Debbie Jolly. We had the opportunity to meet her. She was participating throughout the whole procedure. And I'm sure my colleagues at the Secretariat of the committee, in particular Jorge, and also committee members really value her contribution, the contributions of DPAC, and I would like to honor her memory and to express that we also remember her, and that we appreciate the opportunity that you gave to us to be involved in the first inquiry process of the committee. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, we miss Debbie every day. But just so you're Katarine Pedreros and you're part of the CRPD Committee Secretariat. Brilliant. Thank you. Okay, if we now go to Gabor and Melinda, please. Oh, we can't hear you, sorry.
Sorry, forgot to unmute. My name is Gabor Petri. I'm International Coordinator at the National Federation of Associations of Persons with a Physical Disability in Hungary. The very long name is MEOS. This is behind me.
Hi, my name is Melinda Farago. I'm a lawyer working also for MEOS, and I'm here to give a bit of legal perspective today.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. We look forward to hearing from you in a bit. And finally then, I think we have got Agata Vida from People First in Hungary. Agata, hi.
Hi everyone. So my name is Agata, and I'm a volunteer with People First in Hungary, People First Association. We are quite a small organization, we have about 30 members, and I have been involved with the organization for about a year or two. So I don't have a huge background in the field, but we do what we can.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Okay, so we are going to go to the first question now, which is for Katarine. So what are the main findings and recommendations of the report on Hungary in relation to Article 19? And Article 19, of course, is the right to independent living and being included in the community. Oh, sorry, we can't hear you.
Hello?
Hey.
I'm very sorry for the sound problems. Well, thank you again. And with regards to Hungary, the inquiry on conducted about the situation in Hungary is the third inquiry procedure conducted by the committee. The first one was concerning the State Party of the UK. The second one concerning the State Party of Spain, and the third one, the State Party of Hungary. And the main aspects analyzed by the committee or brought to the attention of the committee and were the right to living independently and be included in the community of persons with disabilities, as well as the different the violation of the right to equality and non-discrimination, Article 5 of the Convention, and also Article 12 of the Convention, the equal recognition before the law. So the inquiry evaluated these three articles of the Convention, also in conjunction with other articles of the Convention, the rights of children with disabilities, the women with disabilities, older people with disabilities. The main problem or the main situation that the committee analyzed was if the current guardianship regime in Hungary is a violation, constitutes a systematic and grave violation of the Convention. And also if the current policy of deinstitutionalization of the strategy to move persons with disabilities from large institutions into small institutions is in compliance with Article 19 of the Convention and the Convention itself, or if it still constitutes a grave or systematic violation of the Convention. So after analyzing this main problem with these three aspects, Article 12, Article 19, and intersectional discrimination, the committee decided that it founded these multiple forms of discrimination, as well as systematic and grave violations of the Convention due to the legislation that still in Hungary authorizes the guardianship on the basis of disability, despite the legal reforms that have been implemented in the recent years. It also found that the system of institutionalizing people on the basis of impairment is discriminatory, and this also violates systematically the rights of persons with disabilities, and is a grave violation of the rights. In this case, it highlighted the grave and severe violation and impacts of institutionalization on the rights of children with disabilities. And it also concluded that this guardianship and institutionalization have affected disproportionately in Hungary persons with psychosocial disabilities, persons with intellectual disabilities, who are the largest group represented in these in institutions, as well as older people, children with disabilities, and the committee also found grave and systematic violations of the rights of women with disabilities.
Thank you, Katarine, for that summary. Wide-ranging and very damning report. So I'm now going to turn to Mayos to answer the question about what has been the response to the report in Hungary by the government, by media, and by civil society to those findings and recommendations.
All right, so the question is about government, media, and civil society. I will start with media. Just as you said that at the time of the UK report, you had the election of Trump, which was quite unexpected and distracted much of the media. We had a similar distraction, which was, of course, the COVID-19. I think the report was published sometime in the middle of April. And of course, that was just right in the middle of the lockdown. So the whole country was suffering from those measures. Schools were closed, restaurants were closed, people were asked to work from home. This was just really far from ideal to make an impact, to have the media recognize the importance of the report. There were just not enough media response to the report. We did some research before this meeting, and there were a couple of media features covering the findings of the report, but not many. And we had the sense that even those articles that were published, they got much lower significance in the press than they would have got, say, 2 months before the pandemic. There's, of course, another problem, and this may sound a bit subjective. This is my opinion anyway, that when I research for reports on or coverage in the Hungarian press about the UN report, I found a handful of media reports from opposition media, but not so many from government-leaning press outlets. I don't know if other speakers from Hungary would agree with me, but it certainly felt as if the reports on the UN country report were not really well covered in national media either. With regards to the government response, I think it was quite low profile. I will ask the representative of the Ombudsman's office to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think just again, I can explain it probably with the pandemic and with the grave situation the country was at the time of the publication of the UN report. I think social authority, or the social ministry and authorities were really busy with trying to protect people. So there was really little attention paid to this report. I found no real high-level government response to the findings of the report. And what civil society did about the report, that was, of course, a different story. We tried our best. Several Hungarian DPOs published analysis of the report, highlighting findings that are relevant to their constituencies. We at MEOS did the same. We published a summary of the findings of the report from the perspective of people with a physical disability. We also circulated this short summary in our monthly newspaper and published it online as well. Some other organizations, such as the Hungarian Civil Liberties Union, made effort to translate the findings, and I think they produced a couple of really pretty infographics trying to explain the findings of the report and put it into context so that people can really pick up the major messages. And we also sent the findings of the report to our membership, which I forgot to mention when I introduced ourselves, that MEOS is a national umbrella organization founded in 1981, so a couple of years before the democratic changes. And we have nearly 100 member organizations, local and regional organizations as well, all of them founded and run by disabled people themselves. So we have a quite broad membership, many thousands of members who receive our newsletters. So we did try our best to promote the findings of the report to them. And what we are going to do is even more. At the moment, it's still summer holidays for much of the country, but After September, we are planning a couple of webinars, or if the situation allows us, offline events that would focus on different major findings of the report, and we would like to discuss this with our members and members of the public, and invite also some speakers, maybe also from abroad. This would also serve the purpose to really translate the report and its findings in the original meaning of the word translate, to translate it from English into Hungarian, because we are going to cover this later on, but it really is a problem that the report is published in English and people don't speak English so much in this country. Yes, and finally, just one note. Of course, the report came at a very important phase of our work, because we are at the beginning of negotiations about the next phase of the next programming period of European Union funds in this country. So it was indeed very timely, but of course, many of the recommendations presented in the report were already on our agenda and the agenda of other DPOs in the country. So it's not only how we respond to the report, but how the report supports our advocacy efforts. Did I forget about anything? No. Yeah, that's all for us. Yeah.
And Melinda, did you want to add anything at all?
No, not at the moment.
Okay, brilliant. I think it's very interesting hearing kind of the similarities and the differences, the similarities with the media. I mean, certainly here the press coverage that we had all came from papers that were linked to opposition parties. In terms of translations, obviously, we had the benefit that the report was written in English, but it wasn't in an easy to understand format. And I really like what you did in terms of the infographics. And I don't think any of us had capacity to do that. And yeah, I mean, I think again, in hindsight, that would have been really, really good had we had more capacity to put things in more accessible formats. So the next question, the first person I'm going to ask to respond to this question is someone I forgot from the introductions, Petar Stanic from the Office of the Commissioner for Fundamental Rights. So the question is, how do you plan to use the report? What allies can Hungarian DPOs count on or need to get on their side? So Petar, if we can go to you and also briefly introduce yourself. Apologies for forgetting you before. We're very pleased to have you with us today.
No problem. Welcome everybody and good afternoon to all. I am Petar Stanic from the Office of the Commissioner for Fundamental Rights of Hungary. I'm the Chief Legal Advisor for Disability and Equal Opportunities, and I'm also a PhD researcher for the topic of personal autonomy, so I'm dually involved in this topic. First, a brief introduction about what the Commissioner for Fundamental Rights does. We are not part of the government, neither part of the civil society. So the Commissioner is an independent monitoring body accredited by the United Nations. And our mandate is also as a classical ombudsperson, as well as we are the National Human Rights Institution of Hungary. Our role is rather unique because the Commissioner does not have the power to issue legally binding decisions. So our reports have no legally binding effects. Nonetheless, the government and the authorities that we examine, they have a legal obligation to give a response to our reports. And most of our reports, or many of our reports concerning persons with disabilities, are the results of field visits. So we go to even the most remote locations in Hungary to see how the countryside and these isolated areas are doing, as well as monitoring the larger cities and larger institutions as well. Therefore, we have quite a large experience from various areas of the country. And as I have mentioned, we are somewhere in in between the government and civil society, and we often have to take on a mediating role between the sides. We try to enhance the voices of persons with disabilities and to empower them to help channel their voices to the stakeholders and the politicians. because of our independent role, we are involved in most of the government's thematic working groups on human rights. Unfortunately, as Gabor have already mentioned, all of these working groups have been postponed because of the COVID-19 situation. And this really impacted the effectiveness of the UN CRPD report, because as Gabor has already mentioned, the media coverage was rather low, and even the governmental, the focus from the government is also, I would say, insignificant at the moment, because even though we have raised these issues and these questions at the working groups, the actual working groups have not been held via online meetings. So there is a complete silence right now from the government's side. And moving on to the last part of the question, how do we plan to use the report? As we already do, we include in our reports the CRPD convention and the jurisdiction of the committee in all of our reports. And we do regular field visits to various areas and institutions. We are planning on increasing the number of these visits. We have continued the field visits even during the COVID-19 period. We have made special precautionary measures, and we have been also giving out personal protective equipment for the institutions and their workers, because we have found that not many of these institutions can afford to buy the equipment, and also there was a great shortage of equipment in the country as well. We are also planning on launching ex officio inquiries that are focused on the topics touched on by the CRPD report, mostly focusing on personal autonomy and independent living. And we are also trying to help civil society to increase their voices in promoting what they are trying to do, and to help their communications as well, to really have a social impact, as we also see that the report could help us gather momentum to advocate for the rights of persons with disabilities in Hungary. And apart from the field work we are doing, we are also engaged in the theoretical work. There is currently an article under publication by myself and a colleague on the CRPD report to help professionals as well as politicians and the general reading public understand what these reports are about and how the situation is right now in Hungary. We are looking for new ways how we could rearrange our conferences and other communications and events after the COVID situation, which is also very difficult for us right now, because the Office of the Commissioner for Fundamental Rights is being moved right now to a new location. So we are having some turbulence at the moment, but we are definitely looking at ways on how we could help promote the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. That was really interesting. Can I just check with you, Peter? Sorry, did you say that the office itself, the Office of the Commissioner for Fundamental Rights, was handing out protective equipment?
Yes, because as an independent organization and a rather well-known organization, it was easier for us to get this equipment. So wherever we went, and if we had excess amount of protective equipment, we always try to give at least some to the staff working at those institutions and to help their daily lives.
I mean, it's a slight digression, but I find that really interesting in terms of the differences between the way your national human rights instrument and ours. I think Debbie referred to ours when she spoke, the different workings. Thank you for that. Sorry, I just wanted to clarify that because it's interesting. So the same question now to Meos. Given the COVID situation, I mean, it does make planning very difficult. What other plans do you have, and particularly what other allies do you think that you need to cultivate in this?
From a legal point of view, we are planning to initiate legislative amendments in terms of like the Social Act, for example, the Children Protection Act, and we already have an almost ready proposal for the incorporation of reasonable accommodation, because even though Hungary ratified CRPD, so CRPD is part of the domestic law, courts and the administrative authorities are reluctant to directly apply CRPD. And since reasonable accommodation is incorporated only in the Labor Code of Hungary, it's impossible to seek legal remedy when reasonable accommodation is denied. So therefore we prepared but it hasn't been submitted with the Ministry of Justice yet because of coronavirus. But we are planning to use the UN report in this respect as well. So we are planning to amend a bit our proposal. There is also another tool concerning especially the institutionalization, because our organization usually gives like papers on national calls for proposals, and we are planning in the next round, I would say, we are planning to use the findings and recommendation of the report as well. The other way we are planning to use the report is in our strategic litigation work, both in individual cases and in cases where MEOS is enforcing claims in the interest of public. So this is mostly the legal point of view. I don't know whether Gábor, you have anything to add.
I think we just as I have said, we really want to make sure that the people know about the report and that the findings of the report will be used in the following months and years to come in our advocacy work. So that's I think that's the best thing we can have, that we have a paper specifically looking at a couple of issues here in Hungary, and we can point at the paper and we can tell decision makers that look at what the UN is telling you about the situation. More specifically, of course, we have some plans, as I said, to organize a couple of seminars and webinars to disability activists and people interested, professionals, members of the public interested in this issue, because they can be potential allies to our advocacy. But also we also want to use the report in the next months, or maybe even a whole year, before the next programming period for European Union funds start in this country. I think the situation here is a bit different from the UK, because Hungary is the recipient of large amounts of EU funds through EU structural funds, for example, and the way governments or public authorities, or even indeed civil society or private enterprises use these funds impact significantly a couple of the policies important to MEOS. For example, prime example would be obviously accessibility. We want to make sure, for instance, that based on this report, no EU funds will be invested into new institutions. As you may have probably heard, it's much debated how Hungary or the Hungarian government is running the deinstitutionalization program, but some of the aspects are considerably how should I put it? It's hard to find anyone who would agree in some of the measures the government is taking about this program, and I think the report will serve as a tool for us in our advocacy. Finally, another example, accessibility. We do not want to see any more EU-funded investments into public buildings, public transport, public spaces, city center renovations, whatnot, that are not accessible, because if you invest into public buildings or public transport or public services, and the new services, the renovated services are inaccessible to most people, then you can make sure that for many years to come, no one will invest again into these buildings. So it's a lost opportunity. We do not want to see these lost opportunities, and we hope that the European Commission, as a funder to these investments, both accessibility and deinstitutionalization programs, will listen to us and listen to the findings of this report, and they will not support these investments if they are against the rights of disabled people.
Thank you. So now the final person to respond to that question, Agatha, could I bring you in, please?
Yes, thank you. So the way people first organize associations sees it is also advocacy is very, very important to make people aware of the report and its findings. Activism is very important, but also sensitizing people, sensitizing society. I think part of the biggest problem we see is that the whole of society is also, did I lose you? Am I here?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so the whole of society, the mindset of the society is such as well that people are kind of just go along with what is happening. So raising awareness, activism, advocacy, and also much closer collaboration between the organizations and maybe international organizations as well. And also looking at examples of how it is done in different countries, how problems are resolved in different countries, and how people progress in this area would be very important to get that kind of support. I think that's the main point I would like to say here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we'll move on to the next question. So what are the main barriers to getting the report's recommendations implemented? I mean, we've had a little bit about that with the turbulence that's happening around COVID, etc. But is there anything people would like to add to that? So first of all, Peter, what are the main barriers?
Thank you. First of all, I would like to share maybe in a more general way how disability is currently viewed in Hungary, because I feel in general the decision makers and also legal practitioners and other professionals have a rather paternalistic approach, and goes hand in hand is the medical approach to disability. So I would say that we are still quite far behind the internationally accepted ways of thinking about disability. In that I would like to refer to the human rights model of disability, where we should view persons with disabilities as the holders of fundamental rights and active, competent adults who can take care of themselves and who should participate in everything that concerns them. And instead, in Hungary right now, we have a more paternalistic approach where the regime, the entire guardianship procedures and legislation aims to protect these people, but very often it leads to overprotection of the person and result in serious restriction of their fundamental rights. So in my view, the main problem here is not treating persons with disabilities as competent, autonomous adults. And as Gabor has mentioned before, we have a new civil code in Hungary from 2012, and we had high hopes for the new civil code. Regretfully, the new civil code kept almost the entire regulation on legal capacity and guardianship from the previous civil code. it made very little reforms or novel approaches, and it conserved guardianship and thus the restriction of fundamental rights for tens of thousands of persons in Hungary. First, I would like to touch on Article 12, equality before the law, and what the main concerns and barriers are right now in Hungary. I would like to start with the entire concept of legal capacity itself. And in Hungary, legal standing and agency are separated. So the general legal way of thinking is that everyone has the same fundamental rights, but not everybody is allowed to exercise these rights. And the agency, that means that someone can actually exercise their rights, is based on mental capacity. And this means that discriminatorily, many persons with especially mental or psychosocial disabilities are discriminatorily restricted from the rights. The second problem with equality before the law is the concept of supported decision-making in Hungary. Supported decision-making in the new civil code is regulated as a secondary option. So the first option is still guardianship, which means that the person's autonomy is restricted and a substituted decision maker is appointed who will make decisions on behalf of the person. And supported decision making is regulated after these provisions, and also the wording of supported decision making means that supported decision making should be appointed to a person if guardianship is not necessary. So this is probably the first issue we have, and I think that it highlights the way of thinking about autonomy itself. And the concept of personal autonomy is kind of missing in Hungarian legislation, legal practice, and I would say also from theoretical approaches. And this is an area where we have to improve our thinking. And moving on to independent living and Article 19, probably the main barrier is the lack of an overarching strategy, because the current strategy, while we do have a strategy right now, but it's conceptually flawed. As the previous speakers have mentioned or touched on the issue, deinstitutionalization in Hungary is currently understood as breaking down the large institutions and creating smaller institutions, which violates the CRPD Article 19, because deinstitutionalization should mean that no institutions are present, only community-based services and community integrated living is provided for persons. It can be a first step that we break down the large, let's say 200 or 300 persons institutions into smaller ones, but the current strategy focuses on creating smaller, let's say 20 or 40 person institutions. And with these conceptual flows, the whole deinstitutionalization process or procedure is kind of derailed in Hungary right now. And many of the funds are spent improperly because of that. So on the one hand, we do not have enough funds, and the funds we have, we don't spend those properly. And I believe that this is probably the biggest barrier that we have right now, that jeopardizes independent living. And,
Okay.
yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. So that same question. So that same question regarding the main barriers to getting the report's recommendations implemented. Let's go to Mios now, and Gabor and Melinda, please.
Yes, thank you. We agree with what Peter said about the inappropriate scope of the deinstitutionalization strategy and also other things he mentioned. So I will just add a couple of more items. Of course, there are so many barriers. If you ask an advocate anywhere in Europe about the main barriers, they will tell you that we can't make the government do what we want them to do. And of course, that's the main barrier here as well. But more specifically, one of the problems we feel is the lack of unity on the side of DPOs and civil society in general. We sometimes find ourselves in an awkward position when we have to disagree with statements or policy recommendations of other DPOs. Just a couple of weeks ago, there was one DPO representative who sort of said or stated that living arrangements for people up to 12 or 15 may be okay. And of course, we don't agree with this. So what do you do? That's a genuine question to our British friends. What do you do when you disagree with another organization who is supposed to be your ally? And of course, you also agree with that organization on a lot of other positions. How can you avoid being pitted against each other by people on the other side of the table? Another problem is that we have had national disability strategies here in Hungary for many years. I believe it's almost 20 years since we started the first national disability program called Országos Fogyatékosügyi Program in Hungarian, which are a good basis to start. They list up a lot of important measures that may be implemented by the government, but of course some of these measures are never implemented. There are problems with monitoring these measures, and that's certainly a barrier that there's a sort of fatigue on the side of policymakers who may be too used to having measures listed up in programs or in strategies that are later on not implemented, if you get what I mean. So it's good to have reports like the UN report, but there's a risk as well that recommendations, just because we are used to them, are easily forgotten. Of course, stigma is a major barrier, and the prevalence of or the dominance of the medical model, as the previous speaker said as well. And finally, before I hand it over to my colleague Melinda, there's one more problem, and that's the problem of language. Especially for British advocates, it may sound a bit surprising, but it's the situation we live in. English is an official language of the UN, but Hungarian isn't, and hundreds of other languages aren't. And when you have a legal paper that is written up in English and published in English, you need to translate it somehow into the other language, the language of the country which the very report covers. And that's just not easy. Linguists say, and I completely agree with them, that every translation is an interpretation. And that is the core of the issue. There is no authoritative translation of most English language documents in Hungarian. And I think the history of human rights shows many other examples from other countries as well. Just to give you one example, what I'm talking about is the category of supported living, which has many definitions around the world. There are some excellent policy documents produced by ENIL as well as other European level disability organizations that give very good details about the definition of supported living. Still, the Hungarian definition, the legal definition of supported living is something different. And it's really difficult to win the case when you have to argue with people who really believe that the Hungarian definition is good. It's really difficult to make them understand what is the difference between the two traditions, if you will. That it's not only about the number of people under the same roof, but it's also about how the service is run. And another example is that just recently there was a sort of makeshift translation that we received from one of the ministry bodies that translated one of the sentences of the UN report, which mentioned surveillance in supported living arrangements. And the translation they provided to civil society organizations who do not necessarily speak English well enough to check the original English version, the translation sort of implied as if the UN would recommend Hungary to not to provide personal staff in supported living arrangements throughout the day, as if the report would recommend that just let them go anywhere. Don't put staff in supported living arrangements at all, because one word, surveillance, was translated into Hungarian in a way that it could be interpreted as such. I do not agree with this translation. We replied to this email and let other civil society organizations know that it's not about not staffing or not providing daily support to users of supported living arrangements. It is about surveillance. It is about not putting, for instance, cameras on the premises, not having to log in or to document when you are leaving or arriving at the setting, etc., etc. But again, until it stays, it remains an argument between two advocates. It's just an argument, a debate about language, and this is where it's really missing. This is where I feel Hungarian.
Sorry, Gabor, I'm going to need to wrap you up for time. Sorry, because this is fascinating.
That's all right, I'm getting lost in the details of linguistics. You get the message. It would be nice to have an English translation. And by the way, I think that would be a question to Catherine from the Secretariat, whether an easy read translation would be possible, because a lot of people would surely need it.
Okay. Melinda, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, like, talking about language, a very interesting piece of legislation concerning persons with disabilities. The Civil Code, according to the Civil Code, any member of the community may enforce her personality rights in case of a hate speech that is grossly offensive for the community. But this right only belongs to members of communities like national or ethnic minorities, religious minorities, or members of the Hungarian nation. So it means that persons with disabilities are not entitled to defend their personality right when it comes to offending the whole community, which I think clearly shows the lack of intent maybe, and the kind of paternalistic approach that Peter also mentioned. And I just wanted to add one more thing, that when it comes to the enforcement of judicial or administrative decisions, the picture is not so bright. So when the state is held responsible for a violation, it often happens that they are reluctant to act. They won't. They won't do what the court ordered. So I think that's a huge problem, even with constitutional court decisions or the decisions of the Court of European Human Rights.
Thank you very much. So finally, responding to that question then, Agatha, please.
So thank you. That was a lovely overview of the legal aspect of the issue. And I would like to talk about maybe something a little bit more practical. And that is society as a whole. I was talking about society as a whole having the attitude of just accepting what is and the way it is. And so sensitizing would be very important. But the other thing is also that the people who are actually affected, they need to be a little bit more active, a lot more active maybe. We find that people who are in institutions get really very badly affected by the circumstances, and just the idea of being able to move into a smaller institution is already sounds great. So a lot of people, for example, in our city, which is about 200, I live in the south of Hungary, and there are about 200,000 people, inhabitants in the city, and the biggest institution has 30 people living with disabilities in this institution. It's a much bigger institution who they house elderly people as well, but 30 of them are younger and living with disability. Only 3 of them are active and go outside and do things. All 3 of them are our members, but there is a huge apathy on the side of the people who are affected and who are in institutions, and that would be lovely to be able to move them out of this apathy. So that we see that as an issue as well. And also we were talking about the general attitude of the society, that also sometimes even the family can be an obstacle to moving out for people to live an independent life. Another issue is money, that how would people with disabilities be able to survive independently on the amount of money they get. Employment can be a problem also. There is a law that requires employers to employ a certain number of people with disabilities. And if they don't, they get a fine. So a lot of companies, they opt for the fine rather than employing people. Another part of the employers employ people just for the show, so they can get some funds from the government or the EU. And as soon as they have the funds, they let go of the people they had employed. So that's really bad practice also. There are also other companies who employ people with disabilities, but they disregard their disabilities and they give them jobs that they're clearly not able for. So there's no support for these cases. There are also other employers who decide to employ people, only people with disabilities. So that creates then almost a segregated employment for people, which is really also really bad. So money and employment are also an issue on a practical level to have an independent life, is what we have seen. So apart from the law and the legal aspects of the obstacles, and I think that's more or less my point.
Thank you. Really important additions. Thank you. So the final question in this section is for Catherine, and it is: how does the CRPD committee monitor the implementation of the report's recommendations, and what happens if the recommendations are being ignored or are dismissed?
Thank you, Ellen, and it has been really important and really constructive to listen to all of you today. First, I would like to say that here with me in this webinar are also present Harumi Fuentes and Jorge Araya, 2 colleagues working at the Secretariat of the Committee, Secretary of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So also they may take the floor to add, to complement what the responses. Also, this response to you today, to your questions, have been previously analyzed by the 3 of us. So I don't want to attribute only to myself. If I may, if I give you a response, it has been debated and discussed by the 3 of us. And also probably one of them could refer to a question posed by Gabor about the possibility to develop that the committee issue an easy read version of the inquiry report on Hungary. So I would like to start saying that in response to your question, we would like to first to highlight the importance of the role of civil society and organizations of persons with disabilities throughout the inquiry procedures. Really, the committee highlights, and the committee has acknowledged publicly and also during the plenary of the committee, it has recognized the crucial input, the crucial support that civil society and organizations of persons with disabilities have done to their work. Not only in relation to regular procedures, the consideration of state parties reports, but also to inquiry procedures. And you have mentioned today, all your participation have been not only providing information during the inquiry, but also taking part in interviews, being witnesses during the interviews of the visits undertaken to the two countries, to the UK and Hungary. Also, in 2 cases, both in Hungary and in the UK, it was information submitted initially by organizations of persons with disabilities and other civil society organizations, the basis of the establishment of an inquiry procedure by the committee, and then developing it until issuing a support report with findings. So this involvement and this participation of organizations of persons with disabilities is also equally important and crucial in the stage or during the stage of the follow-up. And here I would like to say that the follow-up to inquiry reports is an aspect, is a procedural aspect, is a part of the mandate of the committee that is under development. So it has not been established so far, but is possible to develop it, and to develop it with your contributions and with your inputs and with your ideas. First, the follow-up is announced or is established in the committee's rules, in the optional protocol, of course, in Article 6 of the optional protocol, the last part of the optional protocol, but also in the rules of procedure of the committee. This is my legal part, my legal side here. Talking is Rule 19, which establishes that the committee may request the state party concerned to submit information about the implementation of the report and the recommendations through the report under Article 35. This means information about the implementation of the inquiry within the regular reporting procedure before the committee. The second option that this article establishes is that the committee may ask also the state party to provide information about the implementation of the report, and this is outside this regular procedure. So this is the only articles, these are the only written paragraphs that the committee, as in the Secretariat, that you have so far about the follow-up. Having said that, it is really important that the committee can develop this follow-up procedure not only based on exchanging on written information. You have raised that really the inquiry procedure provided you with an additional tool to raise the profile of the convention in your respective countries. Also that empowered organizations of persons with disabilities. It also created cohesion between the movement of persons with disabilities. It provided a better understanding in practical issues of the convention. So it is really, but also there are challenges, of course, in the implementation. There are challenges in the understanding of the interpretation. There are clearly positions opposing the interpretation and the findings of the committee in the 2 inquiries. So your involvement and your participation are crucial really to promote and to make the most of the inquiry procedure itself. So you can, for instance, you can request, you can think about what would be an ideal scenario of a follow-up procedure that goes beyond the written exchange of information, like information that the state parties submit, and then information that civil society submits, and then an assessment, a written assessment by the committee saying, yes, we find that the state party has substantially implemented the report or has not implemented the recommendations, or we have not received sufficient information with regard to this or that recommendation. So this is, as of today, this is how it would look like and follow-up procedure. Written information and then a written assessment of the committee saying, yes, we find information about implemented, partially implemented, not implemented, lack of sufficient information, and that's the end. But what we would like to, and this is again the result of our internal discussion, what we would like to suggest, what we would like to emphasize is that the inquiry procedure was, and the report of the inquiry was not really the end of the inquiry report, was just the beginning, and the beginning first of a dialogue between the state party and the committee about crucial, about important and fundamental rights for persons with disabilities in the two countries. Second, it was an opportunity to discuss and to talk about topics that are not really, that are crucial also for society in general. For instance, in the UK, to speak about the welfare system in the UK, when everybody around the world really admires or had admired this welfare system, this social security protection, and then that an international mechanism could go to the country, could speak to people with right holders, and to realize what were the consequences of the reform to the welfare system, but also to social security and the violations to social security, employment, and independent living of persons with disabilities. That was completely new. And this is a progress in the work on human rights and international human rights. Also, the report is not an end in itself, because the report also has shown in the two cases, and it's what I have been listening to you, is that it really opens an opportunity to discuss at the national level with the courts, also with the independent monitoring mechanisms, such as in the case of the ombudsperson office in Hungary. And to continue the discussion, to continue the work, to continue advocating, to continue filing complaints, constitutional complaints, legal complaints, not only at the national level, but also at the international level, for instance, in the way of individual communications, to follow up on the report and their findings. So I think that at this stage, it is really important that you recognize the added value, the great value of your work so far, that this is really the beginning of the development of the international protection, the inquiry procedure as a mechanism of international protection, and the possibilities to go beyond in the mechanism itself. So this is not the end. This is just maybe the middle of the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. I think that was really, really useful explanation about how, well, firstly, that the use of the optional protocol to trigger special investigations is, a work in progress. The UK and Hungary examples were the first ones undertaken. But also it's so important for us to know that when the findings come out, that's just the beginning of the process, and that it really is up to us how we use it. It's not the UN from on high that's going to come and impose something in our country. It's about when the findings and the recommendations come out, how we use it and all those added benefits that we can get. And certainly in the case of the UK, there was I would say it was important globally for that report to come out, because the government had been going around the world, as you say, trying to export their welfare reform policies, saying how good they were and encouraging other countries were looking at them. I know Ireland was, New Zealand, Canada, and to have a report that exposes the reality of those policies, I think was so important. So it's also about looking at all those added benefits and not just whether the recommendations are implemented or not. Thank you so much. So to all of the speakers in that section, I learned a huge amount, and we could have talked forever. I'm sorry for overrunning on that section of it. I'm now going to hand over to Jamie for final questions and answers. Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you very much. Yes, I agree. It's been very, very interesting. But we tried to go on. We have about 50 minutes left. One short question to you from the UK, Ellen, Rian, and Heather, on what advice you would give to the Hungarian activists. And after that questions, and we have several questions from our chat, but please first, maybe you, Ellen.
Okay, yeah. my final tuppence worth. I wanted actually really to respond to Gabor's point about what happens when DPOs fall out among ourselves over certain things. I think I really like the point that Heather made earlier about how the process of giving and collating evidence has brought us closer together as disabled people's organisations across the UK. But I think specific to that is our context, whereby disabled people's organisations we identify as organisations run and controlled by deaf and disabled people, and we're quite distinct from what we call the charities, where non-disabled people are in control. And I think that in itself gives us a kind of a natural cohesion to some extent. We kind of see it as us and them. So I think perhaps we already have that kind of identity that gives us a greater cohesion. Having said that, there were certain issues that came up with the routine examination in 2017, where there was one national English DPO that the rest of us really fundamentally disagreed with. And where it came down to numbers of us that were opposing them. They basically wanted not to be reporting on benefit deaths issues because they said that there wasn't sufficiently robust evidence on that. We countered that it was a matter of numbers, but it was also the fact that it might not sound particularly nice, but we were prepared to go to the disability press over it and expose that organisation for not properly representing disabled people. I think it was desperate times, and when the stakes are that high, I think it both brings people together, but also makes us prepared to be maybe a little bit harsher with those people who disagree with us. I'll hand over to Ian and Heather now.
Shall I go next? Yeah, it's been so fascinating to hear this discussion, and I think there are similarities between the nation, our context in both Hungary and Great Britain. I think I know talking to our members in Wales, I think people did hang a lot on the fact that we were going to the UN, and then when this very damning report came out talking about systematic breaches, I think people thought that would change everything, and I think the fact that that it didn't, in fact, and things continued to get even worse, was obviously very disheartening for people who are kind of struggling just on a day-to-day basis to survive. I think the fact that we were in a devolved context and we had a different government helped, we could focus our energies there and, push for, changes and progress in Wales with the Welsh government, even though that they didn't have as much power and control over, resources and legislation. I think that gave us a sort of a chink of light, to aim for. So I think it's looking for whatever avenues are open to you, looking for allies where you can. Is there a particular minister, or is there a particular public body or administration? Are there some public high profile people or media contacts that you can make the most of? But also I think it is about keeping in contact and keeping in communication, with disabled people, with, what we call the grassroots, letting people know what you're doing, providing examples, case studies, looking for opportunities so that disabled people can actually tell their own story, to the media or to government. So I think just doing whatever you can to keep the profile high, because I think because I've been around the sort of disability rights movement for quite a long time. There are things change. So you'll be you'll be up one moment and then come down the next, but then there's another. Things will get better. So I think you have, although you want change now, or if not yesterday, I think we always have to keep to the long term. and what we're fighting for is an inclusive future for all disabled people. And whatever we do today will have an impact on tomorrow. So I think it's holding on to that really, and using whatever tool, technique, contact, opportunity, that arises to use it and make the most of it.
Thank you very much. And if we go last to you, then Heather.
Just rather than repeat some of the commonalities there, I think I'll start with a very practical point. One is get ahead with the evidence. As time passes so quickly, and you really do have to have the processes and systems and the communication set up to start gathering evidence as things roll out, as you take your next steps to using the UN report to actually influence change domestically. Another one is, and this goes back to what Ellen was saying about DPOs acting collectively, forming relationships, etc. Yeah, there can be issues, but don't forget others in civil society as well. Those who are working on the likes of CEDAW for women in ghettos, or the Convention on the Rights of Children. There's a lot of similarities there. You can share energy, you can synergize, etc. domestically to raise the profile of human rights and or conventions and covenants, and how these can be incorporated or built in, how they're perceived by the community and the wider public. And finally, I think one of the things that we have really done in Scotland, we're constantly doing it, we are supporting disabled people to have their voices heard. That's really what we are about in Inclusion Scotland. It's so important that decision makers, policy makers, service providers recognise that disabled people have rights to be involved in the matters that affect their everyday lives. And we have the lived experience, we all know this. We have the solutions. So it's really about making sure that disabled people, individuals, activists, DPOs, whatever, are involved at every level. That means informing them, giving opportunities, and making sure that public bodies, governments are supporting that level of involvement, and not just engagement, but actually listening to what's being said to them. That old chestnut.
Thank you very much. We've only got 5 minutes left from a very exciting event as far as I'm concerned. I want to say really, really quickly that there is the appeal that we would like people to write, to copy the text and send an email to either the authorities in Hungary or to the European Union, to the President and Helena Dalli. You'll find it on ENIL. The fastest way is you go to enil.eu, our webpage. Under news, you find events, and there you have the event of today. And you can find these the appeals there. And if we were many to do this, that would be one way of responding and following up on this inquiry. So I highly say that. I've been listening to the synthesizing. Don't use my tax money to institutionalize people or to make the EU inaccessible. Maybe another campaign. But to go from there, we have Catherine who wants to say one more thing. And if there's any time, I do have other questions, but we may have to try to keep the chat open if that's possible. So maybe Catherine, please.
Thank you. Hello?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Jamie, for giving me the floor again. It's just 3 ideas that I would like to highlight, and it's that first, the possibility for civil society to send written information assessing themselves the level of compliance or not with the recommendations of the inquiry report. So certainly you can already, you may use the community and this opportunity to coordinate your efforts and to submit written information. This parallel to the efforts of preparing or formulating a possible follow-up procedure, an ideal follow-up procedure for you, where there are more interaction, where there are more cooperation beyond the written information. Second, the possibility to work and to request from internal mechanisms that implement and monitor the convention. And I'm recalling here mechanisms under Article 33.1, the focal points of the for implementing the convention, and also mechanisms under Article 33.2 of the convention. So you have, remember that the CRPD is the only convention that establishes this unique internal mechanism to implement and follow up. And you have a voice. Many of you participate of these independent monitoring mechanisms. The Ombudsperson office in Hungary, I think, is part or is the mechanism appointed under Article 33.2. So you have really definitely an important entry point to a follow-up at the internal level. And then also the review, the next review of the periodic reports, second and third periodic reports of Hungary by the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The review had been scheduled for March this year, but due to the COVID-19 crisis, it has been postponed and it is going to be rescheduled. So this is maybe could be an opportunity that now that the inquiry report is public, is well known, that also it can be taken by the committee and to conduct a dialogue that includes also the concerns about implementation or lack of implementation of the inquiry report. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. We have 1 minute left to say thanks to everybody, that the questions will be answered on Facebook too, so continue looking for them there in the aftermath. But from ENIL as well as from DPAC, we would like to thank all of the speakers and to all of the people who have listened to us today. Stay tuned for more events. Thank you. Bye-bye.